The Hindenburg leaves her hangar in the spring of 1936. She was the ultimate airship and the pride of Nazi Germany. A leviathan of the skies, she was 804 feet from stem to stern, longer than any of the world's battleships. With a gas capacity of just over 7 million cubic feet, Hindenburg was the largest aircraft that had ever flown. She had been built as an airborne liner to ply the Atlantic route to the United States. Her 72 passengers flew in spacious luxury, housed inside the Hindenburg's massive duralumin hull. They enjoyed elegant meals and relaxed in the saloon, where they were entertained by a special lightweight grand piano, built of aluminium and weighing just 360 pounds. The huge slanting viewing windows were protected from the elements by the Hindenburg's hull and gave a panoramic view of the scene sliding by below. Airmail carried a special Hindenburg stamp. The Hindenburg's galley was all electric, with no open flames. The smoking saloon was sealed off from the rest of the airship. Only electric lighters were allowed on board. Fire was feared by all who designed and flew airships, lifted by millions of cubic feet of highly inflammable hydrogen. The smallest spark could spell disaster. But the Hindenburg seemed as safe as houses. In 1936, she represented the future of long-distance air transport. Cruising at 80 miles per hour, she could cross the Atlantic in just 2 days, half the time of a blue-ribboned liner. Her 4 diesel engines gave Hindenburg a range of 8,500 miles. Total confidence reigned on the flight deck. It was soon to be shattered. What should have been just another transatlantic crossing ended in the most spectacular disaster in aviation history. The greatest airship of them all was herself destroyed by fire in circumstances which have never been fully explained. Mystery still surrounds the last flight of the Hindenburg. The airship era lasted barely 50 years. Semi-rigid airships, like this Santos Dumont machine of the 1890s, paved their way. The father of the rigid airship was a German, Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin. His first rigid airship, LZ-1, took to the skies in July 1900. This is his fourth, LZ-4, which in July 1906 made a famous 12-hour flight from Germany to Switzerland. Overnight, Count von Zeppelin became a world celebrity. The airships he designed became known as Zeppelins. Three years later, the Count formed DELAG, the German Airship Transport Company, the world's first commercial airline. Between 1910 and 1914, DELAG carried nearly 40,000 paying customers to every corner of Germany. Zeppelin was now dreaming of airships which would circle the globe. For the moment, DELAG's horizons were more modest. In conditions which would not have disgraced a first-class railway carriage, passengers enjoy a flight in Schwaben, Zeppelin's first successful commercial airship. In spite of their size, Zeppelin's airships were fragile and accident-prone. The men who flew them had to master modern technology and the ancient elements of wind and weather. Commanding a Zeppelin was likened to skippering a tea-clipper in the great days of sail. Zeppelin's airmen were equal to the task. There were accidents in DELAG's first 4 years, but not a single life was lost. Germany led the world in airship design. In August 1914, German airships went to war. They cruised on reconnaissance flights over France, Russia, and the North Sea. In 1915, they launched a bombing campaign against Britain. They caused little damage, but the but the bombs they dropped opened a new era of aerial warfare. Many of the Zeppelins were brought down by bad weather, or incendiary bullets fired by British night fighters. The Zeppelins were not war winners, but when peace came, their great range opened the way to long-distance transoceanic flights. The first transatlantic round trip, the key to a commercial future, was made by a British airship, R-34. One of her crew parachuted onto American soil to the delight of onlookers after a record-breaking flight which lasted just over 109 hours. As R-34 descended, discharging water ballast to slow her descent, the future of the airship seemed assured. But the high hopes held out for the airship were constantly dashed by disaster. In August 1921, the new British airship R-38, which was on trials for the US Navy, broke in half and plunged into the Humber estuary, killing 44 of her crew. Undeterred, the US Navy dispensed with British help and built its own airships. The most ambitious were the Macon and Akron. Both were lifted by helium, a gas which would not burn, but which was many times more expensive than hydrogen. The formidable reconnaissance range of these airships was increased by turning them into flying aircraft carriers. In their bellies they carried 4 Curtiss Sparrowhawk aircraft. The little biplanes were retrieved by a trapeze lowered from the airship, a difficult maneuver to master. The role of the ground crew was often equally dangerous. These 3 men were yanked into the air by Akron on the end of a landing line. 2 fell to their deaths. The 3rd survived by clinging to the line for over 2 hours. Macon and Akron both perished in accidents. After Macon went down off the Californian coast in February 1935, the American military airship program was cancelled. The British had also pressed on with a new program of airship construction. During the 1920s, it was decided to hold a competition. 2 airships would be built. One, the R-100, by a subsidiary of the Vickers Company. The other, R-101, by the government's own Royal Airship Works at Cardington. It was a classic contest between private enterprise and state funding, and it led to a major disaster. There were not enough top-flight British airship designers and engineers to support 2 projects. Most of the talent was concentrated at Vickers. Its team was led by the brilliant Barnes Wallis, who later designed the Dambuster's famous bouncing bomb in the Second World War. In the summer of 1930, R-100 made a successful double crossing of the Atlantic. Things were not going so well at Cardington. The plan was to use R-101 to open up an imperial air route to India. She was to fly to the subcontinent and back in October 1930, arriving in London at the start of a conference at which the premiers of all Britain's dominions would be gathered. But the R-101 had been plagued by teething troubles. They had been so serious that at the last minute she had been cut in half and 45 feet of extra gas bag added to her midriff. Her outer cover was rotting. R-101 had not been flown on a single high-speed or bad-weather test. She was underpowered and overloaded with fuel. She was a disaster waiting to happen. The airship experts advised against flying. The politicians plowed on. R-101 was loaded for departure. She was further weighed down by a huge red carpet, ready to be rolled out for a VIP dinner aboard her when she touched down in Egypt. A final conference was held at the Air Ministry on the 2nd of October. Lord Thompson of Cardington, the man who had dreamed up the idea of the airship competition, wanted to leave the next day. Eventually, takeoff was agreed for the evening of the 4th of October. The Director of Civil Aviation, Air Vice Marshal Sir Sefton Branca, voiced his doubts. He knew of R-101's inherent weaknesses. Thompson told him, If you are afraid, then do not go. Sefton Branco went. At 8 p.m. that night, the great airship flew over London. Rain and strong headwinds were forecast over France. In foul weather and weighed down by tons of water sloshing around in her cover, R101 crashed into a hillside near Beauvais in northern France. Lord Thomson was burnt to death in his bunk. There were only 6 survivors. After the funeral, the perfectly sound R100 was scrapped, and along with it, Britain's airship program. Meanwhile, the Germans were back in the airship business. Hugo Eckener, Zeppelin's successor, led the way. After the First World War, Germany had been forbidden to operate any new airships. But an airship program began again in 1926. Its first result was the Graf Zeppelin. She made her maiden flight in September 1926. It was a prelude to 9 uninterrupted years of service in which Graf Zeppelin flew over 1 million miles. In 1929, Graf Zeppelin made a record-breaking round-the-world flight. She cruised majestically over Siberia and then across the Pacific. It seemed that only the Germans had the know-how to make the airship dream a reality. In 1936, they unveiled the 129th Zeppelin, the Hindenburg. Most of the money to build her had been provided by Adolf Hitler's Nazi government. Hugo Eckener had wanted to lift her with helium, but the United States was the only producer of this non-inflammable gas. The US government refused to export helium if it was to be used for potentially military purposes. The Hindenburg would have to be lifted with highly inflammable hydrogen. Eckener was not unduly worried. He considered that there was a greater fire risk from the petroleum in the engines than a leak from one of Hindenburg's huge gas cells. Having paid for Hindenburg, the Nazis exacted their pound of flesh. In 1936, there was a referendum in Germany over Hitler's occupation of the Rhineland. Graf Zeppelin and Hindenburg were commandeered by Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry. The Zeppelins crisscrossed the country, showering the population with leaflets and bombarding them with broadcasts. Hugo Eckener, who had nothing but contempt for the Nazis, made no secret of his opposition to the use of the airships as propaganda tools for Hitler. At a voting booth aboard the spanking new Hindenburg, 104 votes were cast for the German leader, none against. But there were those in Germany who were opposed to Hitler's policies of brutal racism and growing militarism. Their groups were small, scattered, and uncoordinated. They watched with growing concern as Hitler tightened his grip. If banned books could be burned by the Nazis, then why not the hydrogen-filled Hindenburg? Hindenburg's first season was a resounding success. A sister airship was under construction and looked set to be completed by September 1937. Even bigger airships were in the pipeline. There seemed to be only one threat on the horizon, a rival transatlantic service provided by American flying boats to the west coast of Ireland. But these aircraft could not offer the luxury travel which was the hallmark of the Hindenburg. Hindenburg sailed serenely on. In Washington, the Germans hit back by laying on special VIP flights for politicians, industrialists, and bankers. Special airmail was delivered, and passengers expressed their satisfaction at the flight.
I enjoyed the trip tremendously. It was a real revelation. We've had a lovely time ever since we left Frankfurt. I only wish we could do it all over again.
On the 3rd of May 1937, Hindenburg emerged from her hangar in Frankfurt for her first transatlantic flight of the new season. Her destination was the airfield at Lakehurst, New Jersey. For some time, the Zeppelin company had been receiving letters from anti-Nazi groups threatening to sabotage the Hindenburg if she continued to fly to America. Some of the letters had been handed over to the American authorities by the German embassy in Washington. There is little evidence that the Zeppelin company took the threat seriously. After all, commercial Zeppelins had been flying since 1900 without losing a single passenger. The flight went ahead. This time, however, the passenger list was not full. Only 36 out of a possible 72. But the return flight was fully booked. The crossing to America was uneventful. Visibility was poor, and passengers spent much of their time relaxing in the bar, dozing, or discussing the political situation in Germany. The Hindenburg glided over ice floes and then icebergs. At least one passenger was reminded of the fate which had befallen the Titanic. Landfall was made over Long Island Sound. Over New York, Hindenburg descended low enough for passengers to spot news photographers on their vantage point at the top of the Empire State Building. The landing at Lakehurst Airfield had been scheduled for 4 o'clock in the afternoon, but there was a delay. Dark rain clouds were massing over Lakehurst. Hindenburg's skipper, Captain Pruss, decided to turn back towards the coast to wait for the anticipated thunderstorm to move away. At 6:30, tea and sandwiches were served on the Hindenburg while it cruised over the deserted beaches of the New Jersey coastline. Passengers idled away the time, gazing out of the windows at the forests of New Jersey below. The weather at Lakehurst cleared, and Captain Pruss commenced his landing approach. At 7:10, Hindenburg appeared over Lakehurst. Down below, passengers for the return flight filed into the departure lounge. Cameramen clung to the roof to record the landing, and newsmen prepared to file their copy. Hindenburg approached the mooring mast. Jettisoning ballast to slow her descent, she came down to 200 feet and prepared to drop her landing lines to the ground. It seemed like a routine landing. Passengers craned their necks for a view from the windows. Soon they would be setting foot in America. As the Hindenburg's steel mooring cable emerged from her nose, a light rain began to fall. The landing lines went down. Then disaster struck. Radio reporter Herb Morrison had a ringside seat.
It burst into flame. Wait, get it started. It's crashing terrible. Oh my, get out of the way, please. It's burning, bursting into flames, and it's falling on the mooring mast, and all the folks agree that this is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. Oh, it's like 400 or 500 feet into the sky, and it's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. The smoke and the flames now, and the flame is crashing to the ground, not quite to the mooring mast. All the humanity and all the passengers screaming around me. I told you, I can't talk to people whose friends are on there. I can't talk, ladies and gentlemen.
Observers had reported a small jet of flame near the upper fin. Within seconds, Hindenburg was transformed into a giant torch. It had taken just 32 seconds from the appearance of the first flame to Hindenburg's final collapse into a mass of twisted metal and blazing wreckage. 36 people died in the inferno. 22 crewmen, 13 passengers, and 1 member of the ground crew. Astonishingly, 61 people jumped, crawled, or were pulled from the flames alive. One of the survivors was the acrobat, Joseph Spar.
The only thing I can do is say that, I don't know, it all happened so fast. There isn't much to figure about. I do think that I'm very lucky that I'm sitting home here, in my own home again, after this experience this afternoon, and as I said before, I'm just happy.
What had happened to the Hindenburg? One moment a monarch of the skies, the next a blackened outline in a New Jersey field. The U.S. Department of Commerce launched an inquiry. The man in charge at Lakehurst, Commander Rosendahl, testified that he had seen a small mushroom-shaped flame forward of the rudder fin just before the explosion. After 18 days of testimony, the Department of Commerce invited Hugo Echner, the grand old man of airships, to deliver his verdict. Echner's verdict was highly speculative. He concluded that as the Hindenburg turned sharply towards the mooring mast, a bracing wire may have snapped in her stern, breaching a gas bag. The escaping gas was then ignited by static electricity when the landing ropes touched the ground in the highly charged atmosphere after the storm at Lakehurst. Tests to confirm this were inconclusive. Nevertheless, an investigation by the German government reached the same conclusion. This left many niggling doubts about the fate of the Hindenburg. How could the static electricity have traveled so quickly up the landing ropes? The small jet of flame seen by Rosendahl had not been captured on any of the newsreel footage of the disaster. The Hindenburg skipper, Captain Max Pruss, had a simpler theory. He believed that the Hindenburg had been sabotaged. At the inquiry, Pruss had been gagged by Joseph Goebbels. The Nazi propaganda chief was determined to slam the lid down on any suggestion that someone could destroy one of the most visible international symbols of the Third Reich. It was not until the Third Reich itself was destroyed that Echner's verdict was challenged. After the war, 2 crewmen came forward to claim that they had seen the flame which had sealed Hindenburg's fate. It was not at the top of the ship, as Rosendahl had testified and Echner had assumed. It was inside, just where a gas bag was pierced by the main central gangway and less than 50 feet from the crewmen's landing stations near the lower fin. The men said that they had heard a sudden pop over their heads. They looked up to see a circle of bright light some 3 feet in diameter. They said it resembled a flashbulb igniting. Had a simple photographic timer set off the flashbulb, which was itself capable of igniting Hindenburg's hydrogen? And if so, who had planted the tiny device which had caused such devastation? Suspicion focused on a member of Hindenburg's crew, a rigger named Erich Spehl. Spehl was a keen amateur photographer and was also rumored to have anti-Nazi views. He was one of only 3 crewmen who normally used the axial gangway. He had the ability, opportunity, and perhaps the motive to plant a bomb. It is unlikely that Spehl would have committed suicide by timing his flashbulb bomb to go off while the Hindenburg was still in the air. So the theory goes that it was time to explode after the Hindenburg had landed. But the delay caused by the storm at Lakehurst had disrupted Spehl's plan, and he was unable to return from his landing station in the bow to reset it. Was the Hindenburg the victim of sabotage or an accident unique in the annals of rigid airships? We shall never know. The anti-Nazi rigger died in the disaster, and Hugo Echner's explanation amounted to no more than a theory. The death of the Hindenburg remains an unfinished story. On the 15th of April 1912, the ocean liner Titanic sank on the 5th day of her maiden voyage. 1,523 passengers and crew died in the disaster. Over 70 years after the Titanic went down, research ships gathered over her resting place 2.5 miles below the icy waters of the North Atlantic. Robot submarines were lowered into the water to probe the secrets of the most famous shipwreck of them all. In Halifax, Nova Scotia, a graveyard contains the bodies recovered from the sea after Titanic sank. They met their deaths in the mightiest ship of the day, the largest man-made moving object which had ever been built. The Titanic had been dubbed unsinkable by the press, and the safety features she incorporated were the most advanced in the world. But like an Atlantic fog, mystery still shrouds the fate which overtook Titanic on that freezing night in 1912. How was it that the unsinkable ship could go down so swiftly and with so great a loss of life? The Titanic was the pride of the British White Star Line. She was 882 feet long, displaced 66,000 tons, and could carry 2,230 passengers. But she was not unique. She had a sister ship, the Olympic, from which she was virtually indistinguishable. Both liners were built in Belfast at the Harland and Wolff shipyard. Olympic was the first of the two ships to slide down the slipway on the 20th of October 1910, her passage into the water eased by 23 tons of grease. 6 months later, on the 31st of May 1911, as Olympic was being readied for her maiden voyage, Titanic was launched. Within minutes she was floating gracefully in the River Lagan before being towed to her berth for fitting out. The VIPs who gathered that day included the American magnate John Pierpont Morgan. White Star might be a British company, but its ultimate owner was Morgan through his International Mercantile Marine Company. It was a time when the transatlantic passenger trade was booming. The only way to cross the Atlantic was by ship. The White Star Line was locked in a cutthroat competition with the Cunard Line for the lion's share of the transatlantic trade. Cunard's two 30,000-tonners, Mauretania and Lusitania, were certainly faster. Mauretania held the blue ribbon for the fastest crossing of the Atlantic from 1907 to 1929. But Olympic and Titanic were bigger and could carry many more passengers. And those who sailed first class enjoyed the last word in ocean-going luxury. The great liners, and in particular White Star's great ships, were like huge floating hotels. The magazine Engineer reported that Titanic had been built for comfort rather than speed. The safety of the Titanic was, in theory at least, guaranteed by a system of 15 watertight bulkheads. These were of varying heights, but all of them rose to at least 2.5 feet above the waterline. Titanic was designed to stay afloat if any two of the 16 transverse compartments formed by the bulkheads were flooded. Shipbuilder magazine called Titanic practically unsinkable. Less cautious journalists dispensed with the niggling qualification. She was unsinkable. If the impossible did happen, there were only 20 lifeboats on Titanic, capable of carrying less than half of the maximum complement of passengers and crew. This was perfectly in accord with the regulations, which had not been updated since 1894, and were based on a ship's tonnage, not the number of passengers and crew she carried. White Star was an accident-prone shipping line. On the 20th of September 1911, less than 4 months after her maiden transatlantic voyage, Titanic's sister ship Olympic was involved in a serious collision in Southampton water with HMS Hawke, one of the Royal Navy's armoured cruisers. The cruiser's ram tore 2 great gashes in Olympic's stern and badly damaged her propellers and crankshaft. The wounded Leviathan had to return to Belfast for repairs. They were to take nearly 7 weeks and cost White Star £250,000, 1/6 of the liner's original building costs. No sooner was Olympic back at sea than she ran over a wreck and lost a propeller blade. Back to Belfast she went for more repairs. On the 2nd of April 1912, after successful sea trials, Titanic left Belfast for Southampton to take on passengers for her maiden transatlantic crossing. The stores she picked up included 20,000 bottles of beer, 1,500 bottles of wine, 32 tons of fresh meat, 40 tons of potatoes, 800 bundles of fresh asparagus, and 8,000 cigars. No one aboard Titanic would go hungry on her maiden voyage, and their saloons and bars would be blue with tobacco smoke. But she was not carrying a full complement of passengers. Fewer than 1,000 boarded at Southampton, 427 of them in first and second class, and 495 in third class. Nevertheless, Titanic's designer, Thomas Andrews, aboard for the voyage, wrote to his wife, "The Titanic is now about complete, and will, I think, do the old firm credit when we sail tomorrow." There were still many notables on the Titanic as she steamed out of Southampton. But one important absentee was J.P. Morgan, who had cancelled at the last minute, pleading ill health. The first stop was to be Cherbourg, in northern France, where another 244 passengers would come on board. 20 fortunate cross-channel passengers would go ashore. Among the first-class passengers were a number of people of immense wealth. Colonel John Jacob Astor, said to be worth $30 million, over $1 billion in today's money. Benjamin Guggenheim, another member of a fabulously rich immigrant American dynasty. And Isidor Straus, the owner of Macy's department store in New York. Taking a free ride in one of Titanic's millionaire suites was Joseph Bruce Ismay, the British chief executive of the White Star Line. Travelling more modestly were the third-class passengers, mostly emigrants on their way to start a new life in America. One fact that none of Titanic's passengers were aware of was that deep in the bowels of the ship a coal fire was burning in one of her bunkers. It had started several days before, but had not been drawn to the attention of the inspectors who boarded the liner at Southampton. Bestriding the bridge of the Titanic was the reassuringly bewhiskered figure of Captain Edward John Smith, the White Star Line's senior, and at £1,250 a year, the highest-paid seaman in the world. It was his job to command all White Star's new liners on their maiden voyages. He planned to retire after this trip. Smith radiated confidence and command, but he had been on Olympic's bridge when she was rammed by HMS Hawke. He was also there when Olympic hit the wreck. And, as Titanic left Southampton, the speed at which Smith took her out caused the liner New York to spring her moorings. A collision was narrowly avoided. After picking up passengers and mail in Cherbourg, Titanic sailed to Queenstown on the southwest coast of Ireland. There she took on more passengers and 1,400 sacks of mail. Then she weighed anchor at 1:30 p.m. on the 11th of April and steamed majestically out into the Atlantic. On the orders of Joseph Bruce Ismay, Smith now accelerated into an area of the Atlantic where there was a gathering ice threat. The winter had been the mildest for years. Numerous icebergs had broken away from the polar ice caps and drifted with the Labrador Current into the Atlantic. To avoid the ice, White Star had charted a southerly course for Titanic. Under normal conditions, this should have kept her well away from any ice fields. But the ice had moved farther south than Captain Smith had anticipated. Nevertheless, it seems that Joseph Bruce Ismay was determined that Titanic should beat her sister ship Olympic's best time for the Atlantic. At gathering speed, Titanic was sailing straight into danger. On Sunday the 14th of April, as Titanic crossed the Grand Banks, she received the first of 6 clear ice warnings. The second warning from the White Star liner Baltic was pocketed by Ismay and not posted in Titanic's chart room for several hours. Oblivious of this, the passengers had settled into the routines of shipboard life. Even those in second class had cabins the equal of other lines' first-class accommodation, while first-class passengers promenaded up and down the impressive main staircase and enjoyed the splendor of the first-class dining room, where the hum of conversation drowned the distant throb of Titanic's mighty engines. That 5th night of the voyage, filet mignon, roast duckling and sirloin of beef were on the menu. By that time, Titanic was moving well into the danger zone. The last ice warning came by signal lamp at 10:30 p.m. from SS Rappahannock. Have just passed through heavy ice and several icebergs. The message was acknowledged by lamp from Titanic's bridge and could have left no doubt that she was now in a major ice field. Yet her speed was maintained. Up in Titanic's crow's nest, Seaman Frederick Fleet was straining his eyes for ice. There were plenty of binoculars available for the task, but he did not have any in his freezing perch. The sky was bright with stars, and the sea like a millpond. The absence of wind made it more difficult to spot an iceberg, since there were no breaking waves, which would have been quickly spotted by lookouts. As it was, Fleet had no time. At 11:40 p.m. he saw a huge mass dead ahead. His warning bell, which caused the liner to swing to port, tolled the end for Titanic. 40 seconds and 500 yards later, she struck the iceberg a glancing blow. Quantities of ice cascaded onto Weldeck Sea between Titanic's bridge and forecastle. On the bridge, Second Officer Charles Lightoller felt a slight shock, a slight trembling, and a grinding sound. It took the iceberg, reeking of rotting fish, just 10 seconds to open Titanic up like a sardine can. The Titanic's designer, Thomas Andrews, went below with Captain Smith to inspect the damage. 5 of Titanic's watertight compartments were flooded, and water soon spilled over into a 6th. "How long have we got?" Smith asked. Andrews replied, "An hour and a half, possibly 2. Not much longer." Strangely, it took another 15 minutes before Titanic's powerful Marconi wireless telegraphy apparatus sent out the first in a long series of distress signals. Another 25 minutes passed before an order was given to prepare the lifeboats, and it was not until 12:55 a.m. that the first was launched. When it became clear to Benjamin Guggenheim that Titanic could not be saved, he went to his cabin and, with his valet, donned full evening dress to die like a gentleman. Although the orders were women and children first, Isidore Strauss's wife Ida refused to leave her husband, declaring, "As we have lived, so we will die, together." John Jacob Astor bade goodbye to his pregnant wife and stepped back to await death. The tragedy of the Titanic was compounded by the fact that the crew mistakenly believed that the lifeboats could not be lowered fully loaded. Only the last few boats to leave the ship were crowded. Many left half empty, while officers armed with pistols held passengers back. It was an incredible scene. Distress rockets burst over the brightly lit ship. Through the roars of steam released to prevent the boilers exploding came the strains of the ship's orchestra, running through its repertoire from ragtime to religious music. At At 1:55 a.m., the last lifeboat slipped away into the ice field. The band struck up, "Nearer My God to Thee." 1,500 passengers and crew, nearly all men, were left behind. But not Joseph Bruce Ismay, who had stepped into a lifeboat after his wife. At about 2:20 a.m., Titanic began her death throes. She had been sinking steadily by the bow, but now she began to plunge more steeply, sending the hundreds left on board towards the stern. A funnel broke free and crashed into the water, crushing scores of people swimming desperately for survival. There was a series of deafening explosions as her boilers broke free and crashed through her. Her lights, kept going by the heroic efforts of the ship's engineers, finally flickered out. The air trapped in her stern kept her afloat for a last few minutes. Then she was gone, and all was silence. At least 16 ships had heard Titanic's distress calls, one of which was the very first SOS signal in maritime history. But only one ship, the Cunard liner Carpathia, arrived on the scene with sufficient speed to make a difference. Her captain, Edward Rostron, made 24 knots through the ice to Titanic's reported position, clearing his ship's decks for action and firing rockets from her bows to signal his approach. Rostron plucked 705 numb and shivering survivors from the lifeboats and made for New York. News that Titanic was in trouble had reached the press in New York in the small hours of the 15th of April. But the full story was not known until Carpathia arrived on the evening of the 18th of April. The newsmen were waiting for the survivors, checkbooks in hand. Ghouls were about too. When Carpathia lowered Titanic's lifeboats, they were stripped that night for souvenirs. Later, Titanic's name was sanded off. The press swarmed over the crew who had manned the lifeboats. In the shocked aftermath, there was many a tale to tell. Among them, reports that a well-lit ship had passed within sight of the Titanic but failed to heed her signals. Titanic's crew had to rely on charity. Their pay ceased when the ship went down. Captain Rostron was the hero of the hour. In Britain, the press was already picking up the themes of Titanic's high speed and lack of lifeboats. Ships were now searching for bodies in the area where Titanic went down. The Mackay Bennett, which set sail from Halifax on the 22nd of April, picked up 190 bodies and buried 116 of them at sea. In London, a memorial service for the dead was held at St. Paul's Cathedral. There was such a crush that thousands filled the streets outside. Two inquiries, American and British, followed the disaster. The Americans were at pains to fix the blame for the deaths of so many of their fellow countrymen on British incompetence. The British inquiry was marked by frequent muddles between Titanic and Olympic and arguments about where exactly Titanic went down. It also investigated the phenomenon of the so-called mystery ship, which had been reported close by, but which was never identified. Some have doubted its existence, but not survivors like Eva Hart, who escaped from the Titanic with her mother. Her father went down with the ship.
I am bitter. Against whichever ship it was, there was a ship close enough to have come to our rescue, and it didn't.
But another scapegoat was at hand. Captain Lord of the California had ordered his ship to heave to about 20 miles to the northeast of Titanic. His radio was switched off, and Lord was asleep, but his officers did see Titanic's distress rockets. But this was only 50 minutes before Titanic sank, too late for California to steam to the rescue. Nevertheless, to the end of his days, Lord bore much of the blame for loss of life. Nor did Joseph Bruce Ismay escape unscathed. No one believed his bluster that he was just an ordinary passenger on Titanic. Ismay was to claim that he had undergone an early version of trial by newspaper. But did his very presence aboard encourage Smith recklessly to maintain his speed and ignore clear warnings that he was standing into danger? Curiously, Titanic's log went down with her. Was this simply the result of confusion, or was it a deliberate attempt to lose the evidence of Joseph Bruce Ismay's orders to Captain Smith? Had Titanic been sailing more slowly, she might have been able to avoid the iceberg. Even if she had hit the berg head-on, Titanic would not have sunk. But the gash in her side was at a point where Titanic's plates of mild steel had been made brittle by the freezing water. 3 million rivets had been designed into her. At that fatal moment, many of those below the waterline were sprung. But what if it was not Titanic that was taken by the sea? In recent years, an ingenious theory suggested that Titanic and Olympic had been switched when Olympic came in for her second round of repairs at Belfast in March 1912. Perhaps the loss-making Olympic had been crippled by her two collisions. Titanic, nearing completion, was virtually identical. Why not switch them and then write off Olympic in the North Atlantic in a crowded sea lane where the rescue of passengers and crew could be counted on? At the British inquiry after the trial, were the inspectors unwittingly examining Titanic rather than Olympic? If switch there had been, it would have been one of the biggest insurance frauds of all time. J.P. Morgan was a man of sufficient ruthlessness to have sanctioned such a desperate measure. He cancelled his trip on Titanic on the grounds of ill health. A few days after she sank, Morgan was found, apparently healthy and happy, at a French spa with his mistress. But the ingenious switch theory was exploded in 1994, when items salvaged from the wreck of Titanic were examined. The Titanic had a hull number, 401, which was stamped on all its major parts. When the helm indicator from the stern bridge was recovered alongside more everyday objects, it bore the number 401 stamped into its bronze stand. There could be no doubt that it was the Titanic which lay on the seabed, surrounded by the poignant debris of the disaster. Many of the victims lie elsewhere, their graves asking the question, how had the unsinkable Titanic, the greatest ship of her day, come to grief? She had seemed like a triumph of engineering, a symbol of man's mastery of the physical world. But it was the physical world, in the form of an iceberg, which sank her, able to do so because of inherent faults in her design. The other causes were all too human. Captain Smith's reckless disregard of a series of danger signals, egged on by the equally reckless Joseph Bruce Ismay. Between them, they doomed the ship. And it was the spurious legend of her unsinkability that doomed many of Titanic's passengers. They delayed clambering into the lifeboats, little realizing the peril they were in. When they did, it was too late.